I'd like to open up my introduction of Christopher Avery. Now, Christopher, if you haven't heard of Christopher, he's been around these Agile circles for some time, but he actually was a keynote in Munich not too long ago for a Scrum gathering. Now, Christopher's, he'll come up and he's going to talk about the responsibility process. But what I'd like to share with you about responsibility is gurus will come in and they'll start talking about why you should take responsibility. You guys hear that? A lot of gurus out there, people write books. You should take responsibility. You should be present. But the question is, how do you do this? It's the how that makes things change. It's the how that really gives us a roadmap of things that we can implement in our day-to-day lives. Any Agile coaches out there? Got Agile coaches? Scrum masters? Leaders? You're like the boss. What we have to do is we think about the why we should be great leaders and why we should take responsibility, but how do we actually process this? So with that, Christopher's going to come in and he's going to talk a little bit about how Agile leadership folds right into the responsibility process, and he's going to talk a little bit about how we can become more responsible and actually respond and have that as a foundation of our own leadership. So with that, Christopher Avery.
Thank you, man. Good morning. How many of you think maybe we should have fewer leaders and more leadership? Anybody? So do you know, I have a PhD, so every now and then I look at the scholarly literature, but I haven't worked in that arena for decades. Do you know that just over the last few years, when you look at the survey studies about leadership, all of a sudden there's now a category called shared leadership, which they also call shared responsibility, which talks about the quality of a system, of a culture, rather than the quality of a person, where the culture allows people to emerge and essentially share leadership, which I see also as shared responsibility. My first career as a consultant or coach was as a collaboration or teamwork guy. And what the research since the 1940s has shown on teamwork, about teamwork, is that when teams perform highly, I want you to let me know if you've experienced this. How many of you have been on a stellar team, a true high-performance team? Yeah? Okay. How many of you will be soon? Excellent. When teams perform highly, the research shows three things over and over and over and over and over, and it keeps getting repeated in studies every 5 or 10 years, most recently by Google's famous study about teamwork. But the three things that happen when teams perform highly is, number one, people go beyond what they've been asked to do. And the reason is it's because they feel a sense of ownership or personal responsibility for the thing that the team is doing, and therefore they also, because of the shared responsibility with others, they feel a sense of ownership for the relationships and for the other members. And when that happens in terms of high-performance dynamics, then our communication changes naturally, organically. And we tend to communicate more authentically and real-time feedback and all that really cool stuff. The other two things that happen in terms of studies are that the work itself is its own reward. Right? So what's interesting is you can't actually incentivize high-performance teamwork. You can incentivize people to work together better and cooperate, but you can't actually incentivize high-performance teamwork except by having a great experience of stepping up to this opportunity to share responsibility with others. And the third thing that happens is that it's actually predictable that they knock it out of the park or that they do perform highly. So I was interested in figuring out, this goes way back, what is this stuff called ownership or personal responsibility? And where does it come from? And if it's not there as a leader or as a peer leader, can you generate it? Can you discover it and do something to pull it out? And so that's been my work for a long time, is trying to figure out how does this stuff work, this stuff called personal responsibility, and where does it come from? And I ran into a research program that was in Austin, Texas, which is where I live. And these people were actually identifying a pattern in the mind that shows you how you and I and everybody we know processes thoughts about taking and avoiding responsibility. Right? So want to know more about that pattern? Yeah. So today I want to share with you that pattern. I'm also going to help you figure out what to do about it and how to maybe start applying it. And I'm going to show you some of the models that we've built over the years about how that pattern touches spaces like leadership, like teamwork, like goals, like accountability practices, and things like that. So let me ask you a question. How many of you share responsibility with other people to get something done, but they're not in charge of you, you're not in charge of them, but your performance, your productivity, your reputation, maybe even your compensation depends on what you do together with others. How many of you are in that situation? Yeah. How many of you would like those other people around you to pick it up a little bit more? And how many of them wish you would? So it turns out personal responsibility is a very subjective thing. So anybody here have a copy of this book? Oh, great. So this is just out, just released in October, and I'm thrilled to have it out. People have been asking me to write the book on the responsibility process for 10 or 12 years. I hadn't felt ready. Maybe today you'll learn why. This is a very challenging topic, but it's finally out, and I'm thrilled to bring it here today and share it with you. So personal responsibility is about perceptions of cause and effect. And this process in the mind that I'm going to tell you about is called the responsibility process. I actually call it a process. Some people think of it as a sequence of how our mind organizes thoughts about taking and avoiding responsibility. You'll see some words up there that probably aren't the most positive words for you. What this research has taught me is that you and I and everybody we know are far more powerful and able than we usually give ourselves credit for. And the reason is that when we're not getting things the way we want, we usually cope instead of grow. So it turns out that this pattern has to do with how we cope with problems or with situations that we think maybe we can't change, or how we grow so that we can change them and move towards what we want. So just hold that as we go forward. You and I and everybody you know are more powerful than we usually think we are. And that's a big deal. What it's also taught me is that leadership is innate. Innate means it's natural. Innate means we're born with it. Right? So I believe that the idea, that the question about are leaders born or made, is settled. Leaders make themselves by how they step up to challenges, especially hardships, over and over and over again. And so today what I focus on is personal leadership development. I believe that big L leadership is 95% personal leadership. And if you get that right, then you shouldn't be surprised to turn around and see other people who want to follow you or throw in with you. So today I'm going to be talking about leadership in terms of you're leading yourself so that others will want to follow you as well. So given all this, then I invite you to think about something that you want to change. Right? Let's make this keynote useful. You get something in mind. What would you like to change? You have something in mind you'd like to change? You'd like to improve? You'd like to make different? You'd like to make better? Oh dear, some of you, the color all just drained from your face. Like Avery just put you on the spot. All right, well, this is my invitation to you to start thinking about something that you've always wished would be different, but you didn't think there was anything you could do about it. I'm going to invite you today to start thinking about something that you could change. I want to introduce you to some of my heroes. I'm inspired by clients that I've worked for over the years. And let me just give you quick stories of how these people have learned and practiced the responsibility process to make great changes in their life, in their business, and society. Christoph Stendel is the founder and CEO of a company called Catalysts, which is in Austria. He decided to build the culture around the responsibility process after working with me in 2009. He built some other things into the culture too, but it's a software development company that for the last 4 out of 5 years has been named the #1 most popular employer in all of Austria. And I recently was there and I got to ask people about what it would take to leave, and they said, well, what it would take to leave is to have a major change in how we lead and in our culture. This is a company doing amazing things. They have now investments in some R&D areas. They're working on space travel. They're working on the Hyperloop, and it's just a 6-year-old, 7-year-old company. Tammy Cole. Tammy Cole was an employee, a longtime employee, at the time that she joined the Leadership Gift Program, which is a program that I operate for leaders and coaches anywhere in the world to want to learn this stuff. And Tammy desperately wanted to leave comfortable employment and start her own business, but she was afraid. Right? She was afraid to confront the idea of depending on herself for that revenue. About 1.5 years after we met, she let me know that she had practiced the responsibility process to the point where she was totally ready to leave her job. She's now CEO of a very successful company called DocStrats, and very, very happy. Tom Howdeshell. Tom Howdeshell moved to Kerrville, Texas, a number of years ago. Anybody know where Kerrville is in the Hill Country? So I used to live near there. For many years, I lived out in the Hill Country in a tiny town called Comfort. And I was involved in a 4-H shooting sports program, target shooting with shotguns, and my son. And I went to speak to Rotary about that in Kerrville, and I met Tom Howdeshell there. He had been hired to head up a small plastics manufacturing business in Kerrville that was losing money. And he was brought in to turn it around. It was his first opportunity to be essentially a plant manager and president of an operation. And he moved from North Carolina. He started working with me and brought the responsibility process into his leadership approach and into his entire team. He became, in about 5 years, turned it around from being the worst place in town to work to being the best place in town to work. He was at the top 1% of his industry in all areas in terms of quality and profitability, turnover, what he spent in education. Great story was that for his owner, he sold that business. And the company that bought it essentially ran it into the ground. Tom came to Dallas. He bought into another company called All Plastics and is doing the same thing at All Plastics. And he just went and bought the company in Kerrville after they ran it back into the ground. So the one that he built up and sold, he now owns again. And so I'm thrilled for Tom and for this story. Mary Leah McAnally was a dean of the MBA program at Texas A&M. And she had strong belief in ethics. And her purpose, her goal in life in producing MBAs was to bring a good name back to capitalism and ethics. And she has brought the responsibility process into her own life and into her staff at the business school at Texas A&M University. And it's used in their programs as a leadership framework. And I'm honored to support them. And finally, Jessica Siroki is a 23-year-old fireball who started practicing this material 4 years ago and has dramatically changed her life. She is now speaking out on agile leadership worldwide and has gone from being a part-time student and leadership of charities to now being a full-time director of Agile services and a speaker on the Agile Trail. So this is lots of inspiring stories of people who've learned and practiced this material. Here's where it starts. There's a vast difference between being a responsible person and taking 100% responsibility. So you and I were raised to be responsible, which essentially means to be good, do what we're supposed to do, even if we don't like it. Would you agree with that? Yeah, that's what it means to be responsible. That's different than taking 100% responsibility. Taking 100% responsibility means to own our world. In fact, this is a definition used by one of the most successful coach training companies in the world in their new leadership program, Coactive Leadership. Henry Kimsey House and Karen Kimsey House, his wife, in their book Coactive Leadership, describe leaders as people who take ownership or take responsibility for their world. In taking responsibility, we have a commitment to self-leadership. And in taking responsibility, we realize that we have the freedom to choose. Viktor Frankl, the famous psychiatrist, Austrian psychiatrist that was involved in the concentration camps, he wrote, "In between stimulus and response, there's a space. In between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is choice." So taking responsibility means reminding ourselves every moment that we are making choices, and that we have choices, and that we have options. Now, what does this have to do with agility? Well, there's some people who think that it has everything to do with agility. In the practice of agility, we feel a sense of ownership when it's working well for the whole value stream up and down from just our role or our task. Right? So personal responsibility and shared responsibility are pretty important in the practice of agility. And by the way, my shorthand definition for agility is to be able to change without changing. Change without changing. Well, what does that mean? It means to change directions, change priorities, change tasks, right, without changing who you are in terms of your identity. The hard thing about change in organizations is that we get strict about our identity around a specific role or a specific task, and then it's very difficult to change. And those of you who are practicing Agile at pretty high levels, I think you'll understand that what you build into this is your ability to change what you're doing without changing who you are fundamentally or your largest purpose. So this brings me to talk to you about problems. In all of my years working with organizations and teams, what I've found is that the biggest problems in organizations are not problems within roles or problems within teams or problems within organizations. They're problems between roles, problems between teams, and problems between organizations. Would you agree? Yes? No? Yeah. So I call these problems between. Problems between. And the problem between here is symbolized by this red X. Now, if you're one of the people on one side of this, you could actually look at the person on the other side of this and think that they're your problem. In fact, we do it all the time, don't we? Yeah. And how many of you are being blamed by somebody else right now for being their problem when it's just a problem between your roles? Yeah, this is a significant dynamic in organizations everywhere. Now, what we've learned about that is to make that problem go away, one of us has to feel enough of a sense of ownership for the problem to want to do something about it, to approach the other party and say, does this hurt for you the way it hurts for me? And if it does, would you like it to go away? And for it to go away, it means you and I are going to probably need to work together to do something about this problem between. So all of us who have had some degree of success in our profession have probably learned how to do this in some ways, and we get to repeat this over and over and over again. So this is that basic idea of taking responsibility is a choice. We can either cope with this problem, or we can choose to take ownership of it. So it's not assigned to us, it's outside of our role, but in order for us to do our role, it demands that we take ownership of it and do something about it so that we can move forward. It's the same between departments. Right? Between departments, the red X, problem between, for it to go away, one of the departments is going to have to approach the other and say, does this hurt for you the way it hurts for us? Right? Can we join forces and do something about it? Same for organizations and silos. Right? This is the idea of how do we build a bigger vision that can overcome our siloed goals or our siloed objectives. And also, how do we build a culture that invites us to share responsibility, to share leadership for these problems between that can be so costly and expensive. So let's talk about what happens when we have a problem. Right. Turns out that everything written about personal responsibility from the dawn of ages, all the way back to Homer's Iliad and to Socrates writing about personal responsibility, it's all about what happens when things go wrong. Think about it. When things go right, how many people walk around saying, whose fault is this? But it's when things go wrong that our mind goes into a hyperactive search for cause and effect. Who did this to me? Why is this happening? How could this be? Think about the pithy quotes about responsibility. They say it's not how many times you get knocked down in life that's important, it's how many times you get up. Right? It's not what happens to you that's important, it's how you respond to what happens to you. So if you go and search pithy quotes about responsibility, you'll find out that it's all about responding to challenges, to problems, to bad things happening. So this is kind of cool, because this is where the science of this mental pattern starts. It turns out that when something goes wrong, it triggers this pattern in our mind that I call the responsibility process. So let me see if I can describe that. You're going along in motion towards a goal. I'll use my arm as a force vector in motion towards something you want. Maybe it's just the first cup of coffee of the day that you're in motion towards. Right? And then something happens to stop you. You get blocked. Right? So in motion, blocked. At that moment, we have a little bit of conflict in our mind, which causes us some angst or some upset or some frustration. Right? You're late for a meeting. You jump in your car. You get on the street. Every light turns red. How many of you get just a little bit of frustration going when that happens? Right? So does this idea make sense? You're in motion towards a goal. It can be big or small. You get blocked. That causes some conflict in our mind between what we want and what we have, and that causes some angst or some frustration. So that's what I mean by a problem, something going wrong. That triggers this responsibility process. So let me ask you this. How many times a day do things go wrong? Several? Dozens? Right. How many of you have had 3 or 4 things go wrong already today? Anybody? Yeah, this notion of responsibility is a very active pattern in our minds. So I want to help you understand the responsibility process. Here's what happens. The first thing that happens when this happens in our mind, when we get blocked from having something that we want, or we get a little bit of anxiety, is our mind goes into this hyperactive search for cause and effect, right? And the mind wants to help you cope, so it gives you an answer. Right? And the first answer it gives you, we classify as a lay blame. Right? So that answer is, he did it, she did it, it's her fault, blame him. I call this lay blame. Now, you and I are really, really good at this, even though we've been taught our whole lives that we shouldn't do it. Haven't you? Haven't you been taught your whole lives you shouldn't do it? But guess what? Still, every time something goes wrong, it's our first thought. Right? Well, what our research suggests is that this must be hardwired. This must be the way we're designed. It's the way we're designed to cope with frustration and with problems, to have a quick and easy answer for cause and effect. He did it. It's his fault. Now, the reason that we've been taught we shouldn't do it is why? Because it's not resourceful, right? In the mental state of blame, what you're saying is that you're in the position of effect and cause is where? There. So psychologists have always told us that if we're doing this, if we're in this victim mindset, they call it, then we're powerless. In fact, not only are we powerless, we're giving our power to the person we're blaming, right? And so that's why we're not supposed to do it. But it doesn't change the fact that it's your and my first response when things go wrong. Now, here's what's cool about it, is it's just a mental state. Remember that pattern? You're going to see it again. Each one of those places on that pattern is just a mental state, which means you can get stuck there for a long time or you can get off of it. You can get stuck for a second or a minute or an hour or a day or a week or a year or a lifetime, or you can get off of it. Turn to somebody and say, you can get off of it. Go ahead. Come on, do it. Turn to somebody and say, you can get off of it. If you can give Stacy a yee-haw, you can give me a phew, you can get off of it. How many of you are dealing with a problem with somebody else at work or home or somewhere else and you wish they'd get off of it? How many of you are the one that might get off of it? Yeah. So if we get off of blame, then we land in another mental state. So to me, this is a fascinating pattern, and it's held my attention for a long time. If you acquire this as a skill to be able to deal with this, what you realize is this is foundational. It changes everything. If you can figure out this mental state and how to start ascribing to it, or this mindset, and even build it into your team culture or organizational culture. When we let go of blame, when we stop blaming somebody, our mind does a little quick sort and comes up with another answer. And this answer we call a justify, or you might call it an excuse or a story. Right? So let's say I'm working away at my desk. I've got a meeting to go to. I do one more thing too many, and now I'm stressed. I really need to leave. I reach for that place where I can always keep my keys. They're not there. Guess what my first thought is? Who took my keys? Right? My first thought, I've known this material for years. I've been studying it, practicing it for years. It doesn't change the fact that I have something wrong. My mind hands me an answer. Somebody took my keys. Well, I do a quick research in my mind of the last hour since I came to work, and nobody's been in my office. So that actually knocks me off of blame. My next thought is, well, no wonder you lost your keys. When you came to work today, you had a million things on your mind. You weren't present at all. You were talking on the phone. Your desk phone was ringing. Your office was a mess from the storm that broke the window and the rain and the wind came in. Certainly anybody in this situation could have forgotten where you put your keys, couldn't they? Couldn't they? Right? So some of you are willing to go with me. Yes, you poor baby. That's a good justify. You're just in losing your keys. And some of you are looking at me like, no, that's just a coping stance. Right? Good for you. So justify is, instead of blaming a particular person or entity or company, justify is a set of conditions that's stopping you from having what you want. Right? You and I are really, really good at justifying. We're really, really good at seeing the situation, the conditions, as stopping us from being able to move forward or do what we want. Do you know what the number one justify is that I deal with in my corporate culture building business? Number one justify. Say it after me. That's just the way it is around here. How many of you have said that recently? Friday, before you went home. On the weekend, in an email. That's just the way it is. Right? It's the way it's always been. That's the way management's always been. We're not going to change it. Therefore, might as well focus on something you can do something about. So justify is a pernicious mental state. It's really good at stopping us from seeing our choices and stopping us from learning and growing in order to overcome the challenges that are in front of us. If you get off the mental state of justifying, it's just a mental state. And it has the same cause-effect logic as blame, which is you're at effect and the cause is out there, but the out there now, instead of a person, remember, is a set of circumstances, a set of conditions. If you get off of that, then we land in another mental state we call shame, often experienced as guilt. And it's not that I want you to feel bad, but I want you to understand that what's happening in this pattern is it's sort of like the mind has a sorting routine, and for the first two mental states in dealing with whatever's wrong, it does an external cause. So it's like the mind says, well, let's flip that variable from external to internal. Oh, I'm the dummy. I'm the dolt. I did this to myself. Oh, will I never learn? Somebody shoot me, please. Do you know this self-talk? Do you know this self-talk? Yes? I've done the research. I know the answer. You're an expert at it. We all are. We're really, really, really good at beating ourselves up when we stop making it about out there. The interesting thing is it's in a different color here because remember that idea about being a responsible person is different than taking responsibility? Do you know that society rewards you for beating yourself up for making mistakes? Right. Oh, good boy. He's taking... Yeah, we call shame or guilt, we call it responsibility in society. I no longer call it that. And the reason is it's not a resourceful mental place. In fact, it's a place of continuing to cope and continuing to get farther away from a solution because you're beating yourself up. The assumption in shame is that there's something wrong with you, and I'm never going to call that responsibility. Right? In fact, in this mental state, we ask the question, we say, what's wrong with me? Stop asking that question. Do you know why? You have an amazing computer up here. When you ask it to give you an answer, what's wrong with me? It'll start a list. Born the wrong decade, the wrong family, got all the wrong genes, went to the wrong school, had the wrong first boss, on and on and on and on and on. Right? So asking what's wrong with me is the wrong answer. The truth is, if you're beating yourself up, if you're experiencing guilt or shame about making a mistake or a problem, congratulations, you're human. You have the opportunity to learn. So a better question would be, how long do I deserve to beat myself up for being human? So I'd really like to turn to somebody next to you and say, how long do you deserve to beat yourself up for being human? Go, do it. All right. So, if you stop beating yourself up for having a problem or making a mistake, then there's actually another mental state that we graduate to. And these are all coping states. They're all mental states that you can stay in for a very short time or a very long time. If you graduate from shame, you land in a state called obligation. And obligation is also considered by society to be being a responsible person. Now, I don't want you to get this confused. Obligation doesn't mean that you have a commitment or a promise. Obligation is how you feel about it. Obligation is the mental state where you feel like you have to, don't want to. Have to, don't want to. Have to do something you don't want to do, have to be somebody you don't want to be, have to put up with having some set of circumstances you don't want to have. Right? Have to, don't want to. So people ask me, they say, Christopher, what's wrong with obligation? Isn't that how we design work? Right? We sign people up and then we hold them accountable. Here, sign the poster, right? say, well, first of all, there's nothing wrong about obligation. It's a human mental state when we're in a position of an internal conflict between what we want and what we have. There's nothing wrong with any of these mental states. However, what you want to think about in terms of productivity is that in the mental state of obligation, our productivity, our performance, is barely adequate to get a pass. And the reason is, when you are in this mental state, it feels like a trap. It feels like a burden. It feels like a poor use of your time. And so your motivation is to survive that trap, that moment. So if I were to give you a test, how many of you have some stupid meeting you have to go to? Not this one, of course. Stupid meeting, if your boss is in the room, you don't have to raise your hands. Have to go. How many of you have some stupid paperwork you have to do? Boring, horrible paperwork, have to do it. The only reason I do it is because I have to. You know this language of have to. How many of you have some kids' event that you have to go to after work? You say to your buddies, oh, I'd like to get a cold, frosty beverage with you, but I have a kid thing I have to go to. Listen to that language. How many of us have to go to our in-laws for holiday? Yeah, so our performance is barely adequate to get a pass when we're operating in this mental state, yet society calls this being a responsible person. Doing what you're supposed to do, even if you don't like it. That's being responsible, by golly. I call this part of the cultural trance that you and I are exposed to. There's another issue with obligation, besides low performance, is that you build up this virus in the mind called resentment. And we feel resentment towards whatever it is that we think has us trapped. We resent the spouse, we resent the bank or the mortgage, we resent the boss, we resent our kids, we resent our elderly parents that need us to take care of them, whatever it is that we think has us trapped. And here's the interesting thing about learning to apply this, and I'm going to give you some tools to apply this, is if you've been making your own choices, your own decisions for more than 3, 5, 10 years, how many of you have been doing that? Making your own choices for more than a few years? Anybody? Who's the architect of your reality? Yeah, which means if you want to refactor it, who gets to refactor it? So in my experience, this green area is where a lot of our professional society hangs out. In my experience, the more I work with folks like you, I realize you and I are actually pretty darn good at getting off of these red areas pretty quickly. We have been so conditioned by society to, quote, be good, be responsible. We hang out in these green areas. It's not until we refuse to feel trapped that we actually start accessing our mind in ways that open up this notion of choice, that open up this notion of freedom, that opens up this notion of power. So responsibility I also call just a mental state. And it's a mental state that's available to you and me all of the time. It's just that when we have problems, when we have anxiety, when we have upsets, frustrations, big or small, we tend to go to the bottom of this chart and we get stuck at the bottom until we figure out how to pull ourselves up. In this mental state of responsibility, we feel free, we feel powerful, we feel at choice. I'm not exactly sure what's happening, except I think the logic, the simplistic, really almost stupid logic of these lower mental states is removed, and we have access to our complete complex reasoning pathways in this mental state of responsibility. It's really an amazing, amazing place. And so this is the responsibility process. There's a couple of other positions. You can read about those, or I'll be around all day, happy to talk about this. It's my favorite thing to talk about, besides you applying it. But the issue is that no growth occurs below the line. So if you're in an industry that requires you to have learning organizations, constant improvement, then if we're not attuned to what's happening in terms of how we respond to problems, we could simply be in coping states forever. How many of you waste hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars in your company having long periods of blame and justify around problems, right? Eating up tons of times in meetings, all the way up to the boardroom. Right? Yeah, what if we could figure out how to get away from that? So I'm going to give you a number of tips here as I finish. I wanted to build the understanding of the responsibility process for you. Now let's talk about how you can start to apply it and really gain from it. And you see this little light bulb. This is something I'm going to invite you to actually do. So it turns out that if being responsible is different than taking responsibility, then what that means is that it's not about your character, it's not about who you are, it's about your daily practice of having a problem, having a challenge, having a situation you don't like, finding out where you are in a mental state, and figuring out how to get off of that mental state up to the next one. So my first invitation for you, starting right now, starting today, is to develop a responsibility practice. And the way you develop this practice is actually start on little things, right, and build up some ability. Now, how do you do that? Well, most people, when they realize that they've got one of these things operating in their mind, this responsibility process, they want to know what to do about it. All right, so let me stop and ask you, how many of you think that you've got one of these patterns in your mind operating this way? Yes? No? Yes? A few of you do. Most of you are just kind of looking at me. Shake your head up and down if you think maybe you've got one of these patterns working in your mind. Others aren't so sure. Skeptical group. All right. Well, if you think that this is going on, then most people want to know what to do about it. And here's what to do about it. We've discovered that there's 3 big keys to unlocking the responsibility process and to practicing responsibility. And each of these keys is a power of the mind that you're already born with. So all you need to do is tap into it and actually develop it. And you can develop it like any muscle that you can develop it. You can develop it as a skill. And the first key is intention, or what we know as free will, or we might call it wanting things or desire, intention. Our power of intention, our power of wanting to make things happen or make things come true. So there are lots of things to understand about this power of the mind, but the number one practice is to simply set an intention to get to the mental state of responsibility around every problem, frustration, or upset. And the reason is that's the only place where you can grow to overcome it and stop coping with it. So your choice is to either cope with it and have it continue to eat you up in small ways, or to face it and take ownership of the upset and grow so that it never happens again. The second key is awareness. Awareness has been called the first key to change. Right? Awareness gets a lot of attention compared to intention and the third key that I'll show you in just a minute. I have awareness as the second key, and it's not that important, except if you don't intend to use this pattern in your mind, if you don't intend to get to responsibility, then the other keys don't matter that much. Right? So the awareness key is all about mindfulness, authenticity, being present, being in the now, all of that great stuff. And we have tools for building that, from meditation and yoga and other things. Our awareness practice starts very simply, and you can start it today. Right? You can start it in this session. And that is, just become aware of your mental state when you have some kind of a challenge or a problem. In other words, learn to be what it's like for you to, learn what it's like to be you when you're in blame, when you're in justify, when you're in shame, when you're in obligation, and when you're in responsibility. What's cool is when you put these first 2 keys together, intention and awareness, if you intend to operate from responsibility when you have a problem or a challenge, and you catch yourself in blame, the moment you catch yourself, your psyche kicks you up to the next mental state, justify. And if you catch yourself there, it'll kick you up to the next mental state. You'll start feeling bad. Like I said, it's not that I want you to feel bad, I want you to know what it means. It just means instead of blaming outside of you, you're blaming yourself. And if you can catch yourself beating yourself up, then your psyche graduates you to obligation. This is how we know the pattern works so well. We see it over and over and over. And if you can catch yourself in obligation, then you can actually start the process of subconsciously or even consciously kind of pinging, sending a message to your mind saying, okay, help me take ownership of this. Help me grow to get out of this coping state and grow to overcome this challenge so that I never have to deal with it again. So this awareness practice is very simple. Just catch ourselves in these mental states. The third key is confront. It's kind of a negative word for a lot of people, but this is a perfect word here. Confront means to face. Right? So it turns out that these internal challenges that we have, they're usually upsets because there's some unexamined belief or assumption that we have that if we examined it, we might change our mind and we would align more with reality or more with the truth, in which case the problem resolves and we can move forward. So what confront means is to be willing to actually confront yourself, to be willing to look in the mirror and say, self, what is there I'm not seeing here? What is there for me to learn? What is there for me to take responsibility for? Now, interestingly, this idea of confront is built into agility, isn't it? Right? What are we supposed to confront? Impediments. Yeah. In order to confront impediments, we actually first have to confront ourselves about wading into this conflict. So confront is also about courage. It's also about facing the fear. And that's why I challenge you to start small, on little things, little frustrations. So over time, here's what I've learned, is that when we invest time and energy in our relationships and in our lives in blame and justify, we produce no results. And that's because all the cause and all the power is outside of us. Society reinforces and rewards you for operating from shame and obligation. When we do that, we get results, but they're not very satisfying. And so we only get results that matter when we get to and operate from the mental state of responsibility. And hopefully some of the stories that I told you about some of these folks who've inspired me, who get to do that over and over, show you what those results can be. Now, I'm a little sorry I didn't say this before some of the people followed the law of 2 feet and left the room, but you're here, so it's important for you to hear this. The responsibility process only works when self-applied. Right? So if you're sitting there texting that person you dearly love and say, honey, I now know what's wrong with you, you're stuck in justify. They now have 2 problems. The problem that got them stuck in justify and you. And guess which problem is bigger for them? Yeah, you labeling them. So this is not a management tool. This is not a judgment tool. This is not an evaluation tool. This is not a weapon to throw at other people, right? Remember, if they're blaming or justifying or in shame or obligation, they're human. They're responding the way we respond. We react to problems. And so hitting them over the head with it as a weapon is not going to help them. It only works when self-applied, which means if you want to help somebody else, if you want to help your team, it means figuring out how do you invite them in to take a look at this and to learn it for themselves. How do you teach it to them? How do you invite them to look at it with you? So the biggest successes I've had with teams is when teams have talked about this together and decided together to use it as a sense-making framework for solving challenges and for solving problems in the organization. So I'm going to invite you to think about that. So in order to do that, you might want to download a copy of the poster. So one of the things that we do is we have a translation project, and we've produced the poster of the responsibility process now in 27 languages. It'll soon be 29 or 30. We've got some in process, including Klingon, if you're interested. And you can get the poster at my website, ChristopherAvery.com/poster, or go to the resources section. And here's what it looks like. 8.5 by 11, full color PDF. But what's cool is on the back is a review of all the teaching point summaries that I've gone through today, so that you can remind yourself of that, and you can even have a conversation with people that you care about this pattern and about how you could start to use it with each other. So once again, that poster is at christopheravry.com/poster. Let me give you another couple of tools. We just have a few minutes left. This is where it all started for me, was how can I take responsibility for building and leading a team when people don't report to me? And what we learned is that if I will actually feel a sense of responsibility for wanting to be on a great team, for demanding to be on a great team, then I have to face the fact of, am I a person that deserves to have great teammates? So that starts to change how I show up on the team. Then what we've learned is there's a simple 5 conversational framework that if we'll follow this framework, it does the natural organic things that tend to make people come together in shared responsibility on teams. So you can find this team orientation process in my book, Teamwork is an Individual Skill, or in any of our team workshops. I want to tell you about good goals, and you can download this and look at this further. I don't believe in SMART goals anymore, and the reason is that the characteristics of good goals, according to the responsibility process, is a good goal clarifies intention, what we want, it focuses attention, it removes obligation. How many of you, if you were to look at your goals, would see a whole bunch of obligation there? Have to, don't want to. Yeah, a true goal doesn't do that. And it generates energy instead of depletes energy. So we have a new way of evaluating and setting goals because of the responsibility process research. We have a way that we can change any behavior called the Catch Sooner game. The Catch Sooner game says decide what you want to change. Maybe it's eating donuts. Catch yourself, change, in other words, put it down. Forgive yourself for being human and having a habit that took a long time to build. It might take a little time to get rid of it. And then vow to catch yourself sooner next time. This Catch Sooner game is written up in the book, and lots of people use this to change all sorts of habits and behaviors. And finally, I'm going to leave you with the culture building bridge from responsibility to accountability. So how many of you are in a position you like to maybe hold some other people to account for expectations that they're not living up to? Anybody sometimes? Yeah, especially if you're in a management executive position, this accountability is important. So here's what we've learned about practicing responsibility in that situation. We have 4 thought exercises that we want you to go through first. Number 1, where are you operating from? Are you angry and in blame? All right. If so, get yourself to the mental state of responsibility, which is how did you create, choose, or attract this situation where you're not getting what you want from somebody else? Number 2, do you know what you want? Do you know how often we have accountability conversations where the person holding to account doesn't actually know what they want? So get clear about what you want. Number 3, have you asked for what you want? And number 4, do you have agreement from the other for that? What we found is that if we will go through and take ownership for that part of the accountability conversation before we actually approach the other, it turns into a much healthier dialogue. So what's next? Some people have been asking me if I'd be willing to sign the book. By all means, don't be sheepish. Yes, I'd love to. It's a whole lot easier than writing it. So I'll be around all day, happy to sign your book if you'd like to have my signature in it. See me for a pocket card. If you'd like, we've got pocket cards of the responsibility process. Happy to give one to you. And if you're interested in learning more about workshops and culture building, developing your own personal leadership, I'd be thrilled to talk with you about that. Thank you, and please start your responsibility practice this moment.